I'm Mattea Roach, and welcome to Bookends. I want to do a little scene setting for you. If you're in a place where you can close your eyes, maybe close your eyes and imagine. Imagine it's a crisp autumn day in Toronto. The year is 2002. Maybe there are people wearing low-rise jeans. You're walking past the Honest Ed's sign at Bloor and Bathurst. Maybe you're meandering down Bloor to one of the several second cups around Bloor and Spadina to grab a little latte. When suddenly you're attacked by one of your girlfriend's evil ex-lovers who has unexplainable magical powers. Very stressful addition to your previously idyllic fall day. This is the world of Scott Pilgrim, the contentious yet beloved comic book character. He was created by my next guest, Bryan Lee O'Malley. I wasn't in Toronto in 2002. I moved here in the fall of 2015, about 6 weeks before I turned 17. The world of Scott Pilgrim was a big part of how I, and a lot of people that I know who moved to Toronto in the aughts and 2010s, got to know the city. Bryan Lee O'Malley was recently on tour for the Scott Pilgrim series' 20th anniversary, and he joined me in our studio to talk all about it. Hi, Bryan, and thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, Mattea, thanks for having me.
So, I have been immersed in the world of Scott Pilgrim for quite a long time. I know you began thinking about and creating this character when you were about 24, 25. I am today, on the day that we're talking, 25. I think I'll be 26 by the time this goes to air. So I really grew up on these books. I know people that moved to Toronto in part because of reading Scott Pilgrim or watching the Edgar Wright film. How does it feel for you to have made such a cultural impact on a generation of young people, people, again, literally making life choices in part based on engaging with this work, and on comic book lovers of all generations?
It's cool and it's a little scary. So it's like I never thought I could lift my little finger and, change the world in this kind of way. So here we are 20 years later. Yeah, I'm on this tour and meeting people every day, multi-generational fans at this point, like parents and kids getting something out of this thing I made. So it's been unusual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the parents and kids thing didn't even occur to me, because when I was explaining to my mom what this interview was and that I was so excited, she didn't know who Michael Cera was, hadn't heard of the movie. I was like, I watched this in your basement growing up. I don't know how you didn't hear about it. So that's amazing to hear about, parents introducing this work to their children and it being a way that it's just kind of continuing to have an impact. So the series follows this unemployed 23-year-old guy in Toronto. He's playing in a band. He's dealing with the aftermath of this messy breakup. And he comes across Ramona Flowers, who's almost a little bit like the manic pixie dream girl archetype. She's enigmatic. She has crazy hair that's changing all the time. And Scott falls for her only to find himself challenged by these 7 evil exes. One thing that I loved about the 20th anniversary edition is all of these collected extras for the series where you were talking about the drafting process of coming up with these characters. And there's a very cinematic approach and real visual punchiness to everything that we see in the books. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to create these characters and what inspires your approach to graphic novel writing?
The idea of the story is that Scott Pilgrim has to fight his new girlfriend's 7 evil exes. I love that phrase, 7 evil exes. So that when I kind of came up with that, I knew I had something interesting at least. And then I just piled on tropes and silliness for each of these exes. So they each have a unique hook. One's a vegan, he's a vegan rock star, another one's a movie star. 2 of them are twins. So it's just a bunch of silly stuff that I threw in. And I had this format like a fighting game like Street Fighter 2 or something where, he would have to fight everyone, and then grafted onto this kind of Toronto mundane slice of life thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's this one, I think multiple characters who are, as you say, this ex who's a movie star, this ex who's this rock star, are scoffing at the idea that there could be anything interesting about living in Toronto. Mm. And I think that marriage of this fantastical video game aesthetic, anime aesthetic with a city that a lot of people sometimes think is kind of boring and mundane was one of my favorite things about this series, and certainly one of my favorite things about it living in Toronto and finding it quite magical myself. I know manga and anime was a big influence for you growing up, and you've also mentioned the Marvel series Power Pack as a big influence for you. Can you talk maybe a bit about the comic culture that you were immersed in as a kid, as a young artist, and how you came to gravitate to this method of storytelling?
As a kid, I kind of grew up on comic strips like Peanuts, Calvin and Hobbes. Those were really big for me. And I think like comics just kind of became a language that made sense to me. So eventually in my teens, manga and anime started to kind of make inroads over here for the first time, really, and just kind of lit my mind on fire. I just kind of like, it expanded my mind. I'm half Asian too, so I was like thinking maybe that the Asianness of it kind of appealed to me and kind of, I wanted to explore that. So yeah, I started kind of moving in that direction.
When you've mentioned like comics being a language that makes sense as opposed to perhaps, is there's like a cinematic style to your comics. You've mentioned also, I know that you don't like necessarily storyboard in a super traditional way. Some of the collected extras, it's like you have almost a screenplay like method of initially preparing your stories. What does it mean for a particular visual language or art form to make sense or speak to you, I guess? Like I always am curious why especially comics artists become comics artists as opposed to doing a more kind of conventionally formal version of visual art or becoming filmmakers or something. Like
why this? And
why
not
this?
That.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something about comics, yeah, just spoke to me. The drawings, the simplicity of it, the ability to do it all by yourself and to do things that are just as magical as like a major motion picture, you know? CG has finally caught up to my imagination like only the last like 10, 15 years. So, and even so, it's still not quite the same thing. I think there's just something special about a drawing, even a bad drawing, that can just kind of speak to people.
Yeah, there's a different sort of emotional weight and resonance. And it was interesting for me. I rewatched the Scott Pilgrim film in preparation for this interview and also revisited the graphic novels for the first time in a number of years. And I think, you know, the film is something I had seen more, and that visual language is something that I could picture in my mind's eye without even looking at it. And I was shocked by just how much more vibrant and kind of like magical, fantastical the novels were, even though I'd read them before. I was like, wait a minute, why am I assuming the movie is going to be more real, you know?
Film, you know, photography of a real person like has a certain kind of weight to it, but the abstraction of comics has a different reality to it that sometimes can be more real, I think.
When you were living in Toronto in the early 2000s, I've read, you know, this character came to you after you had experienced a bit of a bad breakup, and you built this core cast of characters based on your friend group at the time. You know, your sister inspires Scott also having a younger sister who's living in Toronto with him. And there's these band members, there's his university friends. What's the line between Bryan Lee O'Malley, as you were in like 2002 when you're starting to conceive of this character, and Scott Pilgrim, the character that we see on the page?
Well, there's the thing of just trying to put everything that I'm not into a character sometimes. So yeah, I'm a, you know, quiet, thoughtful, sensitive man, and Scott Pilgrim is this brash fool. So I just wanted to have a character that would do all the things that I would never do, or that would think things I would never think, or could just be a fool. Like I said, fool is like the word that I use for him all the time now that I'm older. Maybe I didn't think of it that way at the time, but I was just kind of observing friends and just curious about life and relationships and still kind of learning about it at that age. So I just kind of just threw everything that I saw into the book and then used it as a playground, I guess, like a weird little virtual reality.
Yeah. It's interesting, you know, for me, having first encountered these characters in this world when I was maybe like 12 or something, around the time that the movie came out, and wasn't living through any of the sorts of things that are depicted in the book. Now returning to it, having gotten through some of the worst of what one's early 20s have to offer, I have this more sense of like horrified recognition of like, I've been that fool before, perhaps, or I've seen some of my best friends be that fool in this manner, and ouch. Thinking about the passage of time, there's a lot of stuff in the Toronto of the early 2000s that we don't have here in Toronto anymore. And one of the iconic sites that we see depicted in Scott Pilgrim is Honest Ed's. There's this scene in the series where Scott accidentally destroys the building. And of course, the building has been destroyed. It's not there anymore. For folks who have never been to Honest Ed's or need a bit of a refresher, can you describe it? I know, it's like you could get lost in there.
That's what it said right on the door. So
yeah, what was it like? And like, what was so special about Toronto 20 years ago that maybe has been lost a little bit over time?
There is something magical about Toronto and also something boring about it. But, I had visited here many times as a kid, like living around Ontario. Obviously, Toronto is kind of like the drain that everything like circles into in Ontario. I moved here. I had never seen Honest Ed. Like for some reason, I never went to the Annex with my family as a kid. So just like suddenly seeing this gigantic sign, like it was so big. I don't think you can really convey the scale of it if you've never seen it. And I just thought it was such a unique, strange thing. And then the interior of the store was truly gave me a headache instantly and was just kind of a nightmare. But it was fun. Like it would be like going on like a carnival ride or something.
That's exactly what I was thinking, is that the sign looked like a sign that you would see at like the Canadian National Exhibition.
Yeah.
And the milieu inside was as disorienting as being at the Canadian National Exhibition.
Yeah, the lighting and the signage. Yeah, it was just overwhelming instantly. So, it really was like going on a crazy thrill ride, like a drop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember going in there to buy sheets for my Frosh Week toga party.
Right, as young people were trying to buy normal, mundane things, but in this insane environment. Yeah, that was so fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. And it was like a rite of passage that they would put in your, I moved to Toronto for university, they would put in your Frosh Week guide. This is a store that you should go to, and you should go to Future Bistro, and you should go to the Second Cup that's in the JCC by U of T. Like all of these things were being kind of given to me as lore.
Well, and it was affordable. It was for poorer folks, and that is something that I think is being lost increasingly in modern days. Like everything's brand name, everything's kind of getting fancier, and not necessarily for the better all the time.
Yeah. That's something I've been thinking about a lot. And again, I moved here 2015, so kind of at the halfway point between when these books were initially coming out and now. And in the 10 years that I've been living in Toronto, I feel like the change that we've seen of just so many of these, like affordable institutions no longer existing, the cost of like rent in Toronto and in so many cities across this country skyrocketing. There's this kind of like way that I think a lot of people romanticize the lifestyle of the characters in the Scott Pilgrim world, where it's like, well, you couldn't live like this anymore. You couldn't be working at Second Cup or at the video store, or in Scott's case, he keeps getting fired from these like vegan restaurant jobs. They're barely making a living, a lot of these characters in the book. Scott's like sharing this 1-bedroom, 1-bed apartment with his roommate and sleeping on a mattress on the floor for the beginning part of these novels. But I guess like 20 years on, I almost wonder, like, what do you think the Scott Pilgrim of 2024 is doing? What do these types of people do in your mind's eye, in your imagination these days?
I don't know, because, people are probably right. You can't really live like that anymore. I was barely scraping by back then. I would get jobs here and there, but I didn't want those jobs. I wanted to spend all my time drawing comics. So it was never enough to really string together like a meaningful amount of money. Nowadays I sell books and I make money. So but I remember that situation of just being that starving artist. And I didn't have really like that much of a romantic notion of it. It's just I just had this drive to make those comics. And it was, the city was conducive to that back then.
My friends who are artists, a lot of them, I think, you can't work at Second Cup and pay your rent and make art. It's like you have to have a job at a bank or at a PR firm or something. And then the way that eats into your time for creating art and for having, these kind of like dumb young adulthood experiences.
Right. Not just your time too, like your motivation, your soul, so to speak.
Yeah, your creative spark. I want to return a little bit to the plot and the specific world of Scott Pilgrim. And I know that about 10 years ago, you talked about how you wanted to center your work, generally speaking, on interpersonal stories. And I think that's really what we see, is that the relationships that Scott has throughout the series, particularly his romantic relationships with Ramona or with his high school girlfriend, big yikes, knives. They're complicated. There are some power imbalances, some things that he does that are maybe, as you say, foolish or not very gallant of him.
Unsavory at times.
Yeah, for sure. Certainly, like, writing this kind of character is not an endorsement, but 20 years on, how do you feel about Scott as a guy? Like, is this someone that you would share nachos with at Sneaky D's? Like, would you chat with him? How would you feel if you observed his behavior in the wild?
I don't know. I always feel charitable towards Scott. You know, he does have pieces of me in him and pieces of my friends. But he kind of just grew into this bizarre invention at the same time. So I don't know if there could be a real guy. Like, and that's part of the problem is, you know, obviously we made a movie and Michael Cera plays Scott Pilgrim and Michael Cera is like amazing and funny and charming in that movie. But it's still like, to a lot of like the fans who love the books, it's like Scott is this other thing. And I think it's just, like I was saying earlier, like comics have their own strange reality to them. You know, we did an animated version too, and that Scott feels totally different to me as well. So whatever kind of alchemy was coming out of my pen back then, it's just its own reality, I think. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard for me to draw a line from my Scott in my head to a real person.
Mm-hmm. I want to pivot to, I guess, probably, you know, talking about the titular Scott Pilgrim. He's obviously the focal point of the series, but I would say the second focal point is Ramona Flowers, you know, this object of Scott's affection, literally the girl of his dreams. He dreams about her before he ever meets her. And she's described as a rollerblading subspace American ninja Amazon.com delivery girl, which is also like, no one says Amazon.com anymore. That's definitely something that's changed over the past 20 years. And we learn about her over the course of the series. She's a bit of a nomad. She makes impulsive changes to her hair and her appearance. And she has this lore of these evil exes behind her that she doesn't always super want to talk about. I think sometimes people reading this work and engaging with it, there's a bit of like a mistaking Ramona for the version of her that Scott sees, who's just like this object of affection. I think one thing that's been really cool with seeing the animated series that focuses a lot more on her perspective is the challenge to that we see. Who is Ramona in terms of her own story? Like, what sort of a person is she, and what does she represent?
Yeah, it's still such a mystery. I don't know. When I write, it's like a black box. But, you know, I went through a breakup at that time, so I think the initial thing was kind of processing that. Like, Ramona was that person, and then, you know, I got into a new relationship, and Ramona kind of like takes on aspects of the new person, you know, and just beyond that, just trying to comprehend romantic relationships. Like, one of the big impetuses for doing like the series the way I did is like, I found that like most of these kind of like teen romancy things would kind of like end with the guy gets the girl, you know, and it's over, happy ending. And I kind of wanted to like start there, and then how do you keep the girl or whatever? Like what happens next? What happens in a week, in a month, in a year? So that kind of exploration over time was really interesting to me. And then, I don't know, I found women fascinating. I like drawing them, even though I'm not great at it. But yeah, I see her as this person who's kind of like never quite satisfied with herself or her situation, and just is always kind of like has her eye on a bigger prize somehow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, the how do you keep the girl thing is so interesting, because I feel like so many romance films, romance novels sort of end with this like capture of, you know, the relationship. It's all about
the courtship.
Yeah. And then it's, you know, certainly in my life, the keeping part is perhaps harder.
That's harder, yeah,
you
for
know,
sure.
That's like the everyday sort of in and out of it, right? Of like when you deal with difficult situations, whether it's the real life difficult situations that you encounter in a relationship or someone's evil exes coming and wanting to fight you, what does that do to people? It's interesting you talk about kind of this fascination with writing women. One of the other major women of Scott's life is this character, Knives Chow, his high school girlfriend, as in not that they dated in high school, but she is in high school when this series begins. She's a 17-year-old Catholic schoolgirl, and she's like totally smitten with Scott. But by the end of volume 6, she's grown into a much more self-assured version of herself. She has kind of maybe the most of a coming-of-age arc of any of the characters in this series. And I've also read in an interview that you did with Anime News Network that you felt a little bit kind of in your early 20s, when you were writing this character, a bit like a teen girl, maybe a bit like Knives in some ways. What does she mean to you as a character?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of me in her. She's kind of like the Asian character. So I was like an Asian character myself, kind of felt like an outsider. And I think a lot of us who get into music and the arts, we have that period early on where we're kind of like outside looking in and idolizing everyone and everything about it, before we kind of get our feet on the ground and like see how filthy the bar is where the band is playing and stuff like that. Like it's just when I moved to Toronto, like I kind of got into those scenes and kind of became more aware of the reality of it. So maybe that character was like an exploration of like that dissonance between the high school mode. High school in the suburbs is like such a different world than, Toronto, the gritty reality of Toronto.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something that she says to one of her like schoolgirl friends where she's like, I only found out that there was even good music 2 months ago.
Right.
And there's this sense of kind of having to catch up to be able to fit in with these older characters.
Yeah, which is, again, that's probably something that's changed a lot for young people because they can find out about all the good music so much faster. You just listen to a playlist and hear all the best songs ever recorded. And I don't know if that flattens the appeal of it in some way, maybe. But yeah, at the time it was like you had to discover stuff. You had to find stuff from people and from sources like that as opposed to just, Wikipedia.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I definitely grew up in the age of the internet, but before the age of the Spotify algorithm being really developed. And so it was easy for me to access a lot of music. I didn't have to go crate digging or anything. But you did have to go looking for it more actively. Like nothing was becoming a major hit off of TikTok. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I first moved to Toronto, I was like 16 turning 17. And there was this real drive to want to kind of develop a cultural knowledge that now, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of like going to see live music with people who clearly like learned about music during the pandemic and they've like never been to a show before.
Oh, right.
It's weird. Like
I'm sure it is.
So that's kind of what that makes me think of is it's almost this like captured, like lost experience of coming into culture that people don't go through in quite the same way.
Yeah, because the immersion is so much, I guess, easier and more complete these days.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like you discover the music through the algorithm and then you go to you look for something specific when you're crate digging as opposed to like, let me buy whatever $5 record and take it home and see if it's any good.
Yeah, certainly it's changed the way that I kind of discover music.
Mm-hmm. There's so much humor in your work. There's a lot of one-liners and things that certainly I've heard people say just in conversation referentially. What influenced the humor in your writing when you were putting together Scott Pilgrim, and how has that humor maybe evolved into the different adaptations of Scott that have come out over the years and other projects that you've done since Scott Pilgrim first launched 20 years ago?
I always liked comedy. I grew up on Calvin and Hobbes, which is one of the funniest comics ever, I think. And what else was happening around then? Arrested Development was happening around then, and that show was huge for me and for a lot of people. I didn't know Michael Cera would eventually star in the film, but like the rhythms of that and the awkwardness and the cringeness of that was a big influence on me. And I wanted to have something that could have pathos and comedy and punching and kicking and all that stuff too.
Yeah. There's also, there's this humor, there's this pathos, and I think part of that pathos is there's this existentialism almost in this series that like these are characters that are dealing with this difficult and uncomfortable process of figuring out what do they want out of life? Like what sort of people do they want to be? Right. That a lot of folks go through in their early to mid 20s. And we see very early on this scene of Scott in this desert, like just curled up in the fetal position, yelling that he's so alone. And death is super present in the series because he's fighting people to the death for Ramona's heart, Was there something that you felt you were trying to say about how people cope with these existential questions that you felt could be particularly addressed through the medium of comics?
I don't know. I don't know if it was that specific. I've always been kind of a little morbid, I guess. I remember in grade 9, my English teacher told my parents that I was obsessed with death. And that has always stuck with me because I was like, I am? I didn't know that. But I've read lots of philosophy and whatnot since then. But I still I have a fascination with mortality. And that's an aspect, it's an underexplored aspect of kind of the punching and kicking genre. And the youth genre of you're young, but what can you accomplish before you get punched to death?
Yeah. No, the sort of being obsessed with death thing definitely resonates because when people, I've definitely had that comment made about me, and I'm always like, well, shouldn't we all be obsessed with it all the time?
How are you not? Yeah.
Isn't it kind of one of the most important things that's going on? That you could die at any time, and it's not going to be necessarily what we see in Scott Pilgrim. It's not going to be that you try to grind the rail at Casa Loma and you explode into a pile of coins.
Right.
But
dramatic and glamorous. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I sometimes think I could be hit by a car tomorrow.
Yeah. I think that every day. Yeah.
You know? There is this sort of rawness that you can get to through comics about loneliness, about dealing with these existential questions that feels a little bit just less overwhelming and sad to sit in than when you're reading, a piece of nonfiction writing that's dealing with these same questions, at least I find.
Yeah, there's something, the comedy helps too, but yeah, there's something about the drawings where it's so personal. It just feels like my brain is dumping on the page and how can you hate that? I don't know. There's something that's vulnerable about it in a very specific way that kind of gives it a pass for some things.
Now there's been 6 graphic novels, there's been a video game, there's been the film adaptation, there's been the TV adaptation. This is a story that's had many iterations and that you've told in a variety of different ways. Is this a universe that you see yourself coming back to or that you think continues to kind of draw you in?
I think in a way, yeah. I mean, especially after doing this series, the Netflix series, it's so much bigger than me and outside of me at this point that I do feel a little bit of responsibility to kind of keep it alive in some way and keep it kind of growing and changing. I think that was part of my impetus to do the Netflix series. And if I, if God willing, gets to do more stuff, eventually I would like to revisit it in some form and kind of keep expanding it.
Well, Bryan, thank you so much for joining me today. Again, as someone who grew up on this stuff, this has been such a joy. Thank you for this project. It means a lot to me and to so many people that I'm close to.
Thank you.
That was Bryan Lee O'Malley with me in our Toronto studio. He's the creator of the Scott Pilgrim graphic novel series, and this year marks its 20th anniversary. This episode was produced by Bridget Raimundo with help from Barb Carey. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to shout out our radio techs and the wider CBC Books team for everything they do to get this show on the air every week. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Next week, you'll hear Eleanor Wachtel's conversation with the winner of this year's Booker Prize, Samantha Harvey. And after that, we'll be looking back at the first 4 months of Bookends in a special highlight show. In January, we're going to be bringing you a brand new lineup of guests. We are so excited to share those with you. Happy holidays, and thanks for listening. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.